Baby of the millionaire cried nonstop in the hospital, until black woman said what turned him pale. The cries had not stopped. For 2 endless days and nights, the newborn's wail echoed through the pristine corridors of the hospital. His tiny lungs carried a grief no machine could silence, no doctor could diagnose. Every attempt failed. Formula bottles, careful swaddling, rocking chairs, lullabies whispered by exhausted nurses. Still, the little boy screamed until his face turned crimson. His fragile fists curled as though he was fighting against a world already cruel to him. The sound was unbearable. It seeped into every corner of the ward, shaking even the most seasoned doctors. Nurses in pale blue scrubs shuffled through the halls, their shoulders sagging from sleepless hours. Visitors passing by quickened their steps, unable to bear the raw, relentless sound. And in the center of it all stood Adrian Cole. To the outside world, Adrian was a fortress of power, an untouchable man who built empires of steel and glass with ruthless ambition. His tailored navy suits, his precise words, his flawless reputation, he was the image of control. But here, beneath the harsh hospital lights, he was unrecognizable. His suit was rumpled, his tie pulled loose, his polished shoes scuffed from pacing. His face, once sharp with authority, was hollow, his eyes bloodshot from 2 sleepless nights. He stood frozen by the glass crib where his 3-day-old son writhed, tiny body heaving with grief that had no explanation. Adrian's throat tightened as he tried to speak, his voice cracking under the weight of helplessness. "Why can't anyone stop this?" His words broke through the baby's cries, but they carried no power, only desperation. A curly-haired nurse stepped forward, her stethoscope swaying slightly as she shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Cole, we've tried everything. His vitals are stable, he's feeding, he's breathing but—" She faltered, her voice catching. "He's grieving." Adrian's head snapped toward her, anger flashing across his face. "He's a baby," he snapped. "He doesn't even understand what that means." But even as he spoke, his chest burned with the truth he did not want to face. 2 days earlier, Amelia, his wife, his anchor, the woman who had softened his sharpest edges, had slipped away during complications after childbirth. One moment, her laugh and warmth filled his world. The next, she was gone, stolen by a cruel twist of fate no wealth or power could undo. Now all Adrian had left was this child, a child who cried as if he already understood what had been lost. Another nurse, younger and hesitant, whispered under her breath, "Babies know, sir. They feel what's missing." Adrian's fists clenched, his jaw locking as rage and denial warred inside him. He wanted to order them to find a solution, a drug, a cure, something, anything. But when he turned back toward the crib, his knees nearly gave way. His son's small body thrashed against the white sheets, mouth open in endless grief, tiny hands clawing at the air. The sight hollowed him. He would have traded every skyscraper, every contract, every cent in his fortune just to stop that sound. But money could not buy peace. The hallway thickened with silence, broken only by the relentless cries of the infant. They echoed against the sterile walls, filling every corner like a storm no one could escape. Even the doctors, usually so composed, lingered in the background helplessly. Their white coats carried no answers. Visitors turned away, pretending not to hear. But the sound was primal, impossible to ignore. Adrian finally sank into a chair, his head falling into his hands. His chest rose and fell sharply, as if every sob from his son struck directly into his own ribs. His voice came out a whisper, raw and jagged. "He'll cry himself to death," Adrian muttered, trembling. The curly-haired nurse crouched beside him, her voice gentler now. "No, sir. He will survive, but he will not stop. Not unless—" She hesitated, her eyes glassy. "Not unless he feels what he's lost. Not unless someone gives back what was taken." Adrian lifted his head slowly, his eyes red and hollow. "Don't you dare say that." His voice was sharp, but his lips trembled. He knew what she meant. He simply could not accept it. The cries climbed higher, sharper, piercing through bone and memory. Adrian pressed his palms against his ears, but the sound only grew louder inside him. It wasn't just his son who cried. It was him too. The grief clawed at his chest, threatening to break him apart. Then, suddenly, footsteps. They echoed faintly across the polished linoleum floor, slow, uneven, dragging with the weight of someone who did not belong. Heads turned in unison, murmurs rippling through the staff. At the end of the corridor stood a young black woman. Her presence clashed against the pristine brightness of the hospital. Her brown coat was torn at the shoulder, her faded green shirt creased with dirt. Her dark hair was messy, strands falling across her tired eyes. She looked misplaced, unwanted, yet her gaze was fixed unwaveringly on the crib. The nurses stiffened in shock. One pointed, whispering sharply, "Her! What is she doing here?" Another muttered, "Is she homeless? Who let her in?" Adrian's head jerked up. His grief-stricken face hardened instantly, rage flaring in his chest. "Security!" His voice thundered through the sterile corridor, commanding as always, though cracked with exhaustion. "Get her out of here!" The woman did not flinch. She stood her ground, her trembling hands fisted at her sides, her eyes never leaving the screaming child. "Get her out!" Adrian barked again, his voice breaking from anger and grief combined. But before anyone moved, she spoke. Her voice was low, unsteady at the edges, yet somehow strong enough to silence the corridor. "He's not crying because he's sick. He's crying because she's not here." The words landed like a blow to Adrian's chest. His breath caught, his entire body stiffened. He stared at her, pale, as though she had voiced the very thought he had buried deep within himself. The woman stepped forward, her torn coat brushing against her knees. Her voice shook, but her eyes glistened with a knowing sorrow. "I know that sound," she whispered. 6 months ago I heard it every night. My little boy cried the same way." The woman's voice cracked as she forced the words out, each syllable carrying the weight of memories too heavy to bear. "He wasn't hungry. He wasn't sick. He just wanted me close." Her throat tightened, but she pushed through, her eyes fixed on the struggling infant. "And when he was gone—" She paused, swallowing hard. That silence was worse than the screaming. The corridor went still. Nurses froze, hands pressed to their mouths, while doctors lowered their eyes. No one dared interrupt, because grief spoken aloud had a power that silenced even the busiest ward. Adrian staggered a step backward, his face ashen. The walls around him felt as though they were closing in, pressing against his chest until he could hardly breathe. He whispered hoarsely, "You lost a baby." Her eyes glistened, tears carving through the dirt on her cheeks. Slowly, she nodded. 6 months ago. Pneumonia. I had nothing. No money, no home, no medicine. I held him until his last breath. The words ripped through Adrian like glass. His jaw went slack, his throat dry. This woman, homeless, fragile, broken, was living the very nightmare he had just begun to face. And yet, here she was, standing in front of him with strength he could not summon for himself. "I know that cry," she continued, her voice steadier now, though her tears betrayed her. "It is the cry of a soul who knows something is missing. He's calling for her, and no machine, no bottle, no lullaby will ever answer him." Adrian's hand shook violently as he gripped the edge of the crib. He wanted to scream, to deny it again, but her words were too sharp, too true. His son's fists punched at the air, his cries breaking into desperate hiccups. The woman took a slow step closer. "Let me hold him, just for a moment. Please." Her voice cracked again. "I can help." Gasps swept through the staff. The curly-haired nurse looked horrified, whispering, "Mr. Cole, you can't. She's a stranger." Adrian's heart raced. His instincts screamed to protect his son, to trust no one, to shield what little he had left. Fear gripped him tighter than grief, fear of being judged, fear of being wrong, fear of letting go. But then the baby's cry rose again, high, raw, unbearable. It was sharper than any doubt, cutting into Adrian's very soul. His knees weakened under the sound, and something inside him broke. With trembling hands, Adrian gave the smallest of nods. The nurse hesitated, glancing between him and the woman, but finally stepped aside. The young woman's hands shook as she reached into the crib. Carefully, almost reverently, she lifted the baby. The child's tiny body squirmed at first, fists thrashing against her faded shirt. But as she pressed him gently against her chest, her heartbeat steady beneath his ear, something shifted. The baby's screams faltered, the cries turned into hiccups, then softer whimpers. His cheek pressed into her collarbone, as though he recognized in her grief something that mirrored his own. And for the first time in 2 days, the hospital grew quiet. The silence felt unreal. After 2 endless days of anguished wails, the sudden calm spread through the corridor like a miracle. Nurses stared wide-eyed, some with tears brimming in disbelief. Doctors exchanged glances, stunned that this stranger, this broken woman in a torn coat, had accomplished what all their expertise could not. Adrian's chest rose and fell rapidly, his breath ragged as he leaned against the wall for support. He could hardly process what he was seeing. His son, his fragile, inconsolable child, rested quietly in the arms of a woman who had nothing, yet somehow gave him everything. The woman cradled the baby close, her cheek resting lightly against his soft hair. Tears streamed down her dirt-smudged face, dripping onto the baby's blanket. She whispered, her words more for him than for anyone else. "Shh, it's all right, little one, I know. I know what it's like to miss her. I know what it's like to want her back." Her voice broke at the end, but the baby didn't stir. His tiny fists, once curled in rage, loosened as though the storm inside him had passed. His body relaxed fully against her chest, his breathing shallow but steady. Adrian's throat burned. His knees threatened to give way as he watched the scene unfold before him. His empire, his fortune, every ounce of power he had built over a lifetime, none of it had been enough to ease his son's pain. Yet this woman, with nothing left but grief in her veins, had soothed him. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on the child. The woman turned slowly, her arms tightening protectively for a moment before she met his gaze. There was no pride in her expression, no triumph, only sorrow deep and endless. Carefully she approached and lowered the baby into Adrian's trembling hands. He clutched his son tightly, pressing the small body against his chest. For a terrifying second he feared the crying would return, but instead his son whimpered softly, then settled, his head nestled against Adrian's shoulder. The man broke. Tears spilled freely down his cheeks, soaking into his son's hair. His body shook with sobs he had fought to contain since the moment Amelia slipped away. He had tried to remain still for 2 days, tried to hold everything together. But now, in the sterile corridor filled with strangers, he was nothing but a grieving husband and a desperate father. The woman stood quietly, her hands falling to her sides, trembling with both relief and heartbreak. She looked at Adrian with a gaze that spoke more than words ever could. A mother who had given comfort to another child because she could never again comfort her own. Adrian lifted his eyes to hers, his voice raw and broken. "You lost him only 6 months ago." She nodded silently, her chin quivering. The weight of it crushed him. He had nearly cast her out, dismissed her as nothing, but she had given his son the one thing he could not: peace. "I'm sorry for your loss," Adrian whispered, his voice rough but sincere. The woman's eyes widened. For the first time in months, someone had spoken those words to her, not with pity, not with judgment, but with truth. And in that sterile hospital corridor, 2 strangers from opposite worlds stood bound together by the same wound. The cry of a child who would never stop calling for what was gone. The air in the corridor felt heavy, as if everyone present understood that something sacred had just taken place. The nurses, who only minutes ago had been frantically debating solutions, now stood in quiet awe. A few wiped tears discreetly, while others simply looked on, unable to believe that peace had finally come through the most unlikely of hands. Adrian held his son tightly, afraid to loosen his grip even for a moment. The boy's soft breath swarmed his neck, the faint weight of his body both fragile and grounding. Adrian lowered his face, pressing his lips to his son's head. The faint scent of baby skin and hospital linen filled his senses. It was a simple thing, but it felt like salvation. His mind churned as he tried to reconcile what had just happened. He had always believed money could solve any problem, that influence and power could bend life to his will. But wealth had not been able to bring his wife back, nor had it been able to soothe his grieving child. It was this stranger, this woman with nothing but sorrow in her heart, who had succeeded where all others failed. Adrian looked up at her again. She had stepped back slightly, as though to distance herself, her torn coat wrapped tightly around her frame. But her eyes betrayed her, wet and shimmering, as if she were still holding her own lost child in her arms. "You saved him," Adrian whispered, voice thick with emotion. The woman shook her head gently. "No, I didn't save him. He just needed to feel that someone understood. Babies. They know when love is near, even if it isn't the love they lost." Her lips trembled as she spoke, but her tone carried the quiet authority of someone who had lived through pain most people could not imagine. The words struck Adrian harder than he expected. His throat tightened again. He realized painfully that in his grief he had been distant from his son. He had stood at the crib pacing, demanding answers, but he had not done the one thing the baby needed most. He had not simply held him. The woman's gaze softened as she saw realization flicker across Adrian's face. "He doesn't need miracles, Mr. Cole. He just needs to know he isn't alone. Hold him. Let him feel you. That's all he needs." Adrian lowered his eyes to the small bundle in his arms. His son stirred slightly, shifting his head against his chest, but did not cry. Slowly, Adrian adjusted his grip, pressing the boy more firmly against him. The baby's tiny hand uncurled, brushing lightly against his father's collar. The touch undid Adrian completely. He closed his eyes, allowing the tears to fall freely, unashamed. The woman watched quietly, her arms folded now as though to keep herself steady. She had given a gift that cost her everything, reliving her own loss to bring peace to a stranger's child. It was both a wound and a healing. In that fragile silence, Adrian finally whispered what his heart had been screaming since Amelia's death. "I don't know how to do this." The woman's voice was soft, almost a breath. "You'll learn. He'll teach you." For a long moment, no one moved. The corridor remained wrapped in silence, broken only by the baby's soft, steady breathing against his father's chest. The chaos of 2 days, the endless crying, the frenzied efforts of nurses, the storm of grief seemed to melt into the background. Adrian stood there, trembling but anchored by the tiny life in his arms. His son had stopped crying, and with that, Adrian felt something shift inside him. The unbearable weight on his chest did not vanish, but it loosened, just enough for him to take a full breath for the first time since Amelia's passing. He looked at the woman again. She still stood a few steps away, as though uncertain if she belonged. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows over her tired face, but they could not mask the quiet strength in her eyes. She had walked into a world that was not hers, risked rejection and humiliation, yet had given everything she had left, her grief, her memory, her love, to soothe a child who was not her own. Adrian swallowed hard. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice still hoarse. She hesitated, almost startled by the question. "Naomi," she said softly. "Naomi," Adrian repeated as though memorizing it. He shifted his son carefully in his arms before speaking again. "I owe you more than I can ever repay." Naomi shook her head firmly. "No, you don't owe me anything. I didn't come here for that." Her gaze drifted to the baby, her expression breaking just slightly. "I came because I couldn't stand to hear him cry like that. It was too familiar." Her words carried a pain that twisted in Adrian's chest. He wanted to offer comfort, but for once he had no grand promises to give, no riches to hand over as solutions. All he had was sincerity. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, this time not just for her loss, but for the cruelty of a world that had taken from them both. Naomi blinked rapidly, her lips parting as though she wanted to respond, but no words came. Instead, she simply nodded, hugging her tattered coat closer to her body. The curly-haired nurse, who had been silent for so long, finally stepped forward. Her voice was soft, almost reverent. "Mr. Cole, the baby needs rest now. Perhaps both of you do." Adrian nodded faintly, though his eyes never left Naomi. For the first time he saw her not as an intruder, but as something far more, proof that love could survive even the harshest loss. As she turned to leave, Adrian's voice stopped her. "Naomi, thank you." She paused, her shoulders tightening, but she did not look back. "Take care of him," she said simply, before walking down the corridor, her footsteps fading into the distance. Adrian held his son closer, pressing his lips to the boy's forehead. "We're not alone," he whispered, as much to himself as to the child. And though grief still burned inside him, hope flickered faintly in the quiet. A hope born not from wealth or power, but from a stranger's broken heart that had, for one fragile moment, healed his own. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more emotional, dramatic, and unexpected tales. And let us know in the comments where in the world are you watching from. We love hearing from all of you. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and keep watching.